Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Traverse Conversations and Connections Across Movements, brought to you by the Rights and Democracy Institute. This episode, episode 4, is our monthly conversation series about our movements for collective liberation as we build towards a just and equitable future for all to thrive. I am your host, Asma Elhuni, and tonight we will be discussing the question, do police belong in schools? I am joined today by my co-host, Ed Taylor, the Director of Community Engagement at the ACLU of New Hampshire, a board member of the Rights and Democracy Project, and a co-founder with me of the group Rise Upper Valley. If you have any questions or if you want to share any thoughts, please do share in the comment section throughout this presentation. There will be space to answer questions. So we're joined tonight by an incredible panel of guests that include New Hampshire State Representative of Lebanon, George Sykes, Emily Honeywell, a former student of Lebanon High School, attorney and expert around ordinances and policing, Kira Kelly, Sarah Wright from Rise Upper Valley, Gilles Bissonnette of ACLU New Hampshire, and Alyssa Brown, who is a licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this very important discussion that is happening in communities across New Hampshire, but also in Vermont and school communities all across the nation as well. Ed, I'm going to ask you to kick this off, this conversation, to explain to our listeners tonight, what are we talking about and the current practice with police officers being embedded in high schools like Lebanon High School and other schools all across the nation?
Thanks, Esma, and thanks everyone for joining us. For many years, local police departments all over this country have worked out an arrangement with school districts to assign police officers to work inside the schools as school resource officers. These officers actually work for the police department and remain police officers while they are in their capacity as SROs. That means they still carry a gun and still have the power to charge or arrest students. And oftentimes the excuse is safety, but effectively they are policing students. Communities around the country are starting to question this practice and have been working to dismantle what has been called the school to prison pipeline, where children of Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, also known as BIPOC, along with poor and working class whites and children with disabilities, are tracked for future incarceration. I'd like to first ask our student guests tonight to give their perspective on the issue. Emily, can you tell us some of your thoughts about school resource officers?
Yep, thank you. So first off, hi, my name is Emily Honeywell, and I'm a former student of Lebanon High School, and I'm here today to advocate against having a police officer in the Lebanon School District. The police have a racist history, whether it's from slave patrols, enforcing the Jim Crow laws, or the fact that to this day, Black people are more likely to be arrested, convicted, and incarcerated more than white people who commit the same crimes. There are endless other examples of Black people being subjected to police brutality to the extent where they have lost their lives at the hand of the police. Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, George Floyd, Freddie Gray, Philando Castile, Laquan McDonald, Michael Brown, Rodney King, Alton Sterling, and Walter Scott. This is to name a few, but the list of names go on and on. What makes you think police in schools won't abuse their power with students behind closed doors? They haven't been afraid to abuse their power before, so what stops them now? With this being said, why are police being brought into schools? Schools are supposed to be a safe place for students. For many students, particularly Black and brown ones, may never feel safe if there's an officer in the building. Students of color are more likely to be suspended and arrested when police are present in schools. How is this a safe environment for them to learn in? How are they supposed to get a good education when they know they're more likely to get in trouble than their white peers? Students of color deserve to feel safe and comfortable in their schools just as much as anyone else. Having police in schools only reinforces the school to prison pipeline, which affects Black people the most. Students should be able to make a mistake while they are young and in school, and police should not interfere with that or be able to discipline kids. The money used to pay the resource officer should be put towards other things, such as improving the schools and adding other things that can be beneficial to the students. There have been several different videos of school resource officers using physical force on students to defuse situations. If these incidents weren't caught on camera, then how many other students would these officers physically abuse? Police oftentimes use their badge as a reason to do whatever they want and to seem above the law, and these videos have proven it. We must also talk about what type of training these officers are getting. Are they even qualified and experienced enough to be dealing with young students and disciplinary actions, or are they only used to treating everyone as a possible suspect whenever someone may get in trouble? At this time, I would like to read a letter written by the teachers union opposing having an police officer in the school. This is difficult because the person who is our SOR is also a friend of ours. But we must recognize this is not about the person, but the position. A position that the majority of high school teachers oppose at this time, and a position that the Lebanon Education Association Executive Board opposes today. We believe that the money would be best used for student support. Currently, we have a student assistance provider, SAP, at the high school and middle school, but there is no such support at either of the elementary schools. Our SAPs have been invaluable to our students. Over the past 22 years, we have experienced a large increase in students who are in crisis, and we do not have enough resources to deal with them. The district pays $65,000 a year or so for the SOR, and we receive little in benefits other than a few class visits a year. All these things should be taken into consideration because at the end of the day, the student's safety comes first, and that's why we're fighting to remove the police officer from our schools. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. Everyone, please give the love. If you are watching, please share your love with Emily. We really appreciate you. And thank you for sharing how important it is that police just really don't belong in schools. And the important letter that also came from teachers. So thank you so much.
Of course, thank you.
And now we're going to call in Alyssa Brown. Alyssa is a licensed clinical social worker and a psychotherapist currently practicing in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Delaware. She has almost 20 years of experience in the field of social work, and much of her work has been with children in schools and school systems. Alyssa, what do you think is the impact on students by having police in schools, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would just like to start out by asking everyone who's on the call to just take a minute to think back to a time where they had an interaction with police. And again, if this is, traumatizing or upsetting, then skip this. But if you're able to return to that experience, and whether it was maybe the first time you got pulled over or the most recent time you were pulled over, or just bringing that into your awareness and kind of sitting with that for a minute and remembering the body sensations and what was going on mentally and physically for you. So just take a minute to kind of sit there in that experience without causing yourself distress. If you're feeling distress, then back out of the experience. But if you can do this without causing yourself distress, then please do so. And just considering the thoughts and the feelings you were having, and what was happening in your body. And now, if you could take a moment to consider what that would be like if there was the possibility of interacting with police on that level all day long, and not just when you are sitting in your car and driving, and thinking about what that would be like if you didn't really have control over those interactions. And lastly, I want you to consider how long it took you to regulate your body and your emotions after that happened, and how long it took you to get back to a space of calm or your baseline. And I would imagine, I know for myself, that it can often take some time. So either hours or possibly days, depending on the interaction. So anecdotally, on an individual level, we know that that police interaction affects all of us, and can cause anxiety, stress, cause body sensations that are difficult for us to regulate. And that's, because there's, the threat of harm and the lack of control, like I mentioned, among, various other things, depending on our identities. So we also know that the brain has a lot of difficulty retaining information when we're in a heightened state of awareness. It's almost impossible for the brain to learn when we're in our kind of fight or flight stance. So the brain has difficulty bringing in and retaining any information. A relaxed brain and nervous system is ready to learn, and if the brain is feeling anxiety, there's not room for learning in those moments. The level of calm and attention and focus that it takes for the brain to get into learning mode is difficult enough in classrooms without the added anxiety of interactions with law enforcement on a daily basis. I grew up in the DARE generation, and I remember being a young person at West High School in Manchester. And despite myself not necessarily ever having a negative interaction with police at that point, I remembered feeling uneasy with the police officer in our school. And I remember experiencing feelings of, why are they here and what's going on? And is something, am I unsafe in this moment? And so feelings of fear around that, and also the feelings of being surveyed and feelings of being watched and kind of, why are they, why are they here? Why are they looking over here? Am I doing something wrong? And, all of those feelings came up, I remember, for myself as a student. I can imagine that's true for many students. And I think, in allowing these officers to be present in schools, we are desensitizing our young people to a level of anxiety and also to a level of policing that is not conducive to a functioning society, and definitely not conducive to learning. It doesn't serve the development of intrinsic control or self-actualization. And add to this the stress it puts on Black and Indigenous students and other marginalized populations who are targeted and disproportionately criminalized across the board. Rarely are students who prove to be unsafe in schools flying under the radar. In most cases, these students have not been fully and appropriately served by the mental health and support services available in schools. And this lack of service is often due to inadequate funding and not enough helping adults trained in mental health and student support. The reallocation of funding to increase student supports and staff training across the board would alleviate many of the school safety concerns without employing law enforcement. We need to take a hard look at how we're being reactive instead of being proactive with our students, and how that is affecting their futures and their mental health. Rather than continuing to harm our young people in this way, it makes more sense to increase offerings of mental health and student support that will encourage the learning and the development of functional young adults. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Alyssa. I mean, I was immediately, your exercise. I immediately thought back to an experience I had, and I almost blacked out. Right. I can imagine, like, I put myself back into that, how much anger, how much fear I had. And it all stems back in my school. We had school resource officers back in South Florida. And thinking about it now, the government did something tricky by making us comfortable with that system of just being watched all the time, right? They had their police cruisers with our school mascot and our middle school name on it, right? They were in our yearbooks, right? Trying to make us feel this attachment, right? So when I was in trouble, I called the police because they're on my side too, right? But when they show up, it's a completely different story. So
Exactly.
I so appreciate you for that, Liz. I really, really do. Y'all, please show some love for Alyssa in the comments. Next, I want to call in my good friend and comrade in so many campaigns for social justice, Sarah. Sarah, can you tell us what you think about this topic, why it's so important?
Hi, everyone. Hoping that my microphone's working okay. Got it? Awesome. I just want to first start off by expressing my deep, deep gratitude for all of the powerful words that Emily and Alyssa shared. So grateful for the important work that they're doing on this issue. So my name is Sarah Raitt. I live in Lebanon, and I've been asked to read a statement on behalf of Rise Upper Valley, of which I'm a member. Rise is a POC, Black, and queer-led grassroots organization working diligently against the violently oppressive actions of police and ICE. We are calling for the removal of the SRO from the Lebanon School District as a matter of policy and principle, as a necessary step toward addressing institutional and systemic discrimination in our school community. The presence of an officer in a school, no matter who that officer happens to be, puts more stress on students who are already marginalized. There's a huge body of evidence that shows that having police in school disproportionately harms BIPOC, queer, low income, and disabled students. We can't create an environment that's safe and supportive for everyone when we're relying on an institution, namely policing, that's grounded in fear, intimidation, and violence. So the following is an excerpt from a 2020 report by a leading researcher of school policing, Aaron Kupchik of the University of Delaware. Quote, "While there is no conclusive evidence that SROs reduce crime among students or prevent mass shootings, the research shows that the potential costs to students and communities are real. The available evidence suggests that the presence of SROs results in a greater likelihood of justice system involvement for youth. Research also shows that schools with SROs tend to have higher rates of exclusionary school discipline, like suspension, than do other comparable schools. Importantly, youth of color are considerably more likely than white youth to experience these harms. A large volume of research demonstrates consistently that youth of color are at significantly greater risk of exclusionary punishment, and that this discrepancy is not accounted for by different rates of student misbehavior. Youth of color are also more likely to be arrested at school and suffer the consequences of an arrest record," end quote. So we know empirically that the presence of an SRO does significant harm to a school community. We also know empirically that students of color who are disproportionately targeted for discipline do not exhibit higher rates of misbehavior. We also know that racism is having devastating impacts in our own school district. So in 2017, Black students made up 3% of the Lebanon student population, but 7.8% of in-school suspensions, 4.7% of out-of-school suspensions, and 6.2% of referrals to law enforcement. We also know empirically that students with disabilities are being criminalized. So in 2017, students with disabilities made up 12.4% of the Lebanon student population, but 28.4% of referrals to law enforcement. In other words, referrals to adults who simply don't have the professional training to understand a student's special needs and who have license to use force in response to behavior that they don't understand. We know that creating an atmosphere of surveillance and intimidation does not result in an inclusive learning environment. And studies show that inclusive school environments have lower rates of misbehavior and criminal activity. So the bulk of evidence in academic circles points to the truth that marginalized students have always known, which is that SROs do not improve the school environment. And ironically enough, in a recent Valley News article, the statements of local police pointed to that same truth. So Claremont Police Chief Mark Chase was quoted as saying, quote, "Police have come to understand that it's often best to leave punishment to school officials," end quote. Lebanon's police chief Mello was quoted as saying, quote, "Our primary goal is to keep cases out of the courts and the juvenile justice system," end quote. Well, if that's the primary goal, then why are we intentionally bringing the justice system into an environment where it has neither the ability nor the trust to protect students from itself? Some people argue that SROs serve as mentors for children, And that makes a lot of privileged assumptions and ignores a lot of people's lived experiences. So as Aaron Kupchik puts it, an SRO, quote, has information about a student or his or her family that would not otherwise be available to law enforcement. Moreover, research demonstrates that youth younger than 16 tend to have relatively poor understandings of their legal rights, which raises important questions about the extent to which most students understand the legal risks to themselves, family members, or friends that may result if they confide in SROs acting as mentors. Further, it is not at all clear why we should expect SROs to be more effective as mentors compared to social workers, school psychologists, or counselors who have extensive training in child development, end quote. If the school district hopes to live up to the values that it professes, then we have to learn how to center the voices of marginalized students, and we have to reimagine what our school environments feel like and how they function. And that's going to take structural change. We have examples regionally and nationally of many other schools that are forging a new path forward without SROs, using tools like restorative justice programs and assembling teams of counselors, social workers, and health professionals who know how to create environments that are safe for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for sharing what our local BIPOC group is saying about police in schools. I just want to remind folks, please drop any questions you have for our panelists in the comments, and we'll get to them a little later in the program. Next, I want to turn to Gilles, an attorney at the ACLU who has been keeping an eye out in the state. Is there anything you think schools and the community should know about SROs?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Ed, for a great presentation. Thank you. This is wonderful to hear everyone's perspective. I want to be clear about what's going on in New Hampshire. We're in a situation where New Hampshire kids are being funneled into the criminal justice system for behavior that should be handled by parents and schools. The school to prison pipeline is alive and well in New Hampshire, and that is in part due to the presence of school resource officers. The ACLU and other stakeholders were involved this past summer in the Governor's Commission on Law Enforcement Accountability and Transparency. And there was a lot of discussion before that commission on school resource officers, what their role should be removed. There were a lot of members of the public who I think correctly advocated the commission for the removal of school resource officers. And I want to read a little bit of the testimony from one individual who was actually also a commission member. He's a public defender, someone I immensely respect. Attorney Julian Jefferson. And here's some data that he presented to the commission that I find just incredibly powerful, and to me is Exhibit A, why we shouldn't be having school resource officers in the state of New Hampshire. Here's some data that he collected. The Manchester Police Department, the largest city in New Hampshire, according to their own data, have initiated prosecutions during the past 5.5 years for 14 juveniles ages 12 and under for alleged felony offenses, and roughly 78 prosecutions for 12-year-old children for misdemeanor offenses. Now, I don't know how many of those are in schools, but no doubt some of them are. And what he says in his testimony that he found alarming, and I do as well, is that 92 prosecutions for children 12 years or younger from one locality is something that we should take a lot of time deliberating about. And I wholesale agree. And the question that he posed to the commission this past July is, would it be a better approach to have disciplinary action handled by parents and school officials if the alleged crime occurred in school? Do we need to resort to the police initiating a prosecution for alleged misdemeanor offenses committed by children? Do we need to resort to the police initiating a prosecution for all alleged felony offenses committed by children? We know that when there are allegations of misconduct that happen by kids in schools, oftentimes those kids are handled through the criminal justice system and at the school their disciplinary process. And that has devastating effects for those kids down the line. And their outcomes fundamentally change, which is why we need to get school resource officers out of schools. And the usage of SROs has skyrocketed over the past 20 years. In fact, really, it's almost become a near obsession. among municipalities. But really what the data shows is that the real crisis isn't violence in schools, but a broad failure of schools and municipality to hire enough support staff to serve students' mental health needs. That is the solution. It is not inserting police officers in schools. So today's students, they are experiencing record levels of depression, anxiety, and many other forms of trauma. So the CDC has presented data that shows the suicide rate among children ages 10 to 17 increased by 70% between 2006 and 2016. And about 72% of children in the US will have experienced at least one major stressful event, such as witnessing violence, experiencing abuse, or experiencing the loss of a loved one, all before the age of 18. Who should be addressing those issues and the behavioral results of that? It should be school counselors, nurses, social workers. They're the ones that frequently are the first to see children who are sick, stressed, and traumatized, especially in low-income school districts. That is who we should be investing in. And the benefits of investing in those mental health services are clear. Schools with those services, they see improved attendance rates, better academic achievement, higher graduation rates, as well as much lower rates of suspension, expulsion, and other disciplinary incidents. And the data shows that the presence of school-based mental health providers not only improves outcomes for those students, but also can improve overall school safety. By contrast, there is, as you heard from Sarah, no evidence that increased police presence in schools improves school safety. And I think in many cases, it causes harm, because when in schools, police officers, frankly, they do what they're trained to do, right? Which is to detain, handcuff, and arrest. And this is going to lead to greater student alienation and a more threatening school climate. So as I said before, a lot of this was addressed here in New Hampshire this past summer before the Governor's Commission on Law Enforcement Accountability and Transparency, which we've termed the LEA Act. One of the things that was flagged, in addition to these broad harms that exist with respect to the presence of SROs, is that in New Hampshire, we have no mandated classroom or field training programs for an officer to become an SRO. There are no model MOUs governing SRO behavior to prevent kids from being funneled into the criminal justice system. So what do you see? You see here what you see nationally, which is when you throw a police officer into a school setting, what's the result going to be? It's going to be where the officer is going to treat behavioral issues as a law enforcement matter as opposed to a disciplinary matter. Again, that is the definition of the problematic school to prison pipeline. Now, unfortunately, the LEA Act Commission didn't have the votes to adopt a recommendation to remove SROs statewide. But I did want to flag for those who are listening and watching what the LEA Act Commission recommendations are with respect to SROs. First, that New Hampshire Police Standards and Training should set forth mandated certification for SROs that would require the officer to complete National Association of School Resource Officers training, number one. Number two, Police Standards and Training should work with stakeholders and oversee the development of a model SRO memorandum of understanding to be used by the police departments that defines the roles, expectations, and prohibitions of the SRO's role. Number three, each law enforcement agency should have a field training program specifically for SROs. And lastly, memoranda of understanding between police departments and schools should be public. All right, these are good efforts, all right, but they work within the system. What we really need to be doing is changing the system and upending it, right? Training's not enough, and it's not an excuse to real reform. So this means divestment. This means, as I said before, still taking SROs out, taking those monies and investing it in the community, investing it into increased mental health services in schools. That's what this means, and that's what we're going to continue to advocate for. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Giles. Wow. 92 prosecutions of children. That's just really sad. And thanks for reminding us that these children need helpers and not to be criminalized, and the need to hire school help providers and not having this school help providers is a failure of the school system. And that we're even here today with an officer in schools is indicative of a failing system. So thank you so much for that. And now we're going to hear from Representative George Sykes of Lebanon. George, Representative Sykes, what are some of your thoughts on this issue? We'd love to hear from you.
Well, first off, thank you everybody for giving me an opportunity to share a couple of thoughts about school resource officers. I'm going to take a slightly different tact than the rest of you in that I'm going to look at this from the perspective of legislatively, and also from the point of view that I believe that community action is the way that we need to move forward to get school resource officers out of the schools. And the way that I always talk about is that we need to make that connection or that nexus, that budgets that we approve as in city government and in other town government, et cetera, those budgets are expressions of a community's values and importance and what they want to see accomplished. And if we don't make that connection that we want to see the budget reflect these community desires, then we're not doing our jobs. Now, the problem is that budgets are canned often and that they just go from year to year to year to year, the same amount being appropriated for different things. And it's challenging to get people to look at, because everybody, I mentioned budgets and they're like the eyes go down and the glaze comes over there because they don't really want to focus on that nitty gritty, but that's where it's at. And I will tell you that another part of the problem is that typically budgets in New Hampshire are separate. We have a school budget and then we have a police budget. And particularly in Lebanon, that position, the school resource officer, is a shared budget expense. So when I introduced a motion to eliminate the school resource officer from the city budget, there were two big objections. One was, we can't do this because we have an agreement with the school department. And they already had, and their budget comes up at a different time. So we need to pay attention about how those mechanics work so that we get people pushing the issue of not having a school resource officer and the budgeting for it. So it's coordinated between those two different legislative bodies. Secondarily, I want to go back to the fact that, again, budgets are an expressions of priorities, and you all have talked about how we should be spending money elsewhere than on school resource officers. And I think we always have to couple that discussion that we want to take some money from here, but we have a better use for it elsewhere. And that coordination of funding in terms of timing and community support, that's the challenge that we face. And for those of you who paid attention in the city council budget discussions in Lebanon, my motion to eliminate the school resource officer's position failed on a 8-1 vote. So I obviously have my work cut out for me, but so does everyone else, because I, as a legislator, both in the city government and also in state government, I will tell you that I listen to, in order of importance, is the people that I represent. I listen to them first. And I am much more likely to pay attention to an issue that's been brought to my attention by citizens and not by lobbyists, et cetera, and so on. No offense to any lobbyists who might be present. In any event, that's my message. Budgets are expressions of community priorities, and we should be reallocating we should be having our community priorities match the money that's being spent. and we do that in a coordinated way, I think we can get where we need to be. It's clear to me that school resource officers don't belong. They don't belong in Lebanon's school. They don't belong in other community schools either, but it doesn't happen because we wish it so. It's because we make it happen through community pressure and budgetary constraints. In other words, getting rid of the funding for those positions. That's my story. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Representative Sykes, for that message. And thank you for reminding us that our budgets are messages of where our priorities lie, of where our values lie. Often the case has been made that the police officers are there for safety. Kira is an attorney who has led many campaigns around policing. What can you tell us about the school board? What can you tell the school board members who believe that maybe having police in schools is a wise decision for the safety of the school?
Sure, thank you. So I'll start just by contextualizing myself. As an attorney, I split my time between pro bono criminal defense and drafting and local legislation that expands and protects fundamental human rights against corporate, federal, and state infringement. And recently I've been working on and am in the process of rolling out a local law template that has customizable municipal policy changes. I'm calling it the Defunding Violence Ordinance, and I've been meeting with groups around the country to share this and to talk about it. And I want to bring an observation from that experience to the forefront of the discussion as a preface to everything I'm going to talk about after. And just that critiquing the institution of police in big cities is a way easier task. Police officers are anonymous uniforms in big cities, and conversations can focus on the systemic and intentional way that police are programmed to violently enforce laws that stabilize oppression in this country along race and class lines. But in a small town, it's different. Emily was talking about this earlier. When we talk about police in a small town, police have faces here. And I think it's important to clarify that I want to stay respectful to the individual human beings when I talk about defunding the police and getting cops out of schools. I want to recognize that people become cops out of a desire to serve their community and a willingness to risk their lives for the greater good. And I want to honor that instinct without encouraging and funding people to take up a profession that by its design pits them and their best interests against the community. So let's take this conversation back to what it is. And it's just this question of whether police are the best solution to creating safe schools. And my co-panelists have cited ample data to show that police do not make schools safer. So that's the answer right there. Police are not the best solution to creating safe schools. Either safety from students, the threat that they might bring, or from outside threats. And to the contrary, the ways that police are trained makes them inefficient and actively counterproductive to the task of creating a safe and healthy learning environment. So when we say that we don't want police to do certain things like mentor children or hold office in schools or break up fights, we don't want police to do them, but that doesn't mean we don't want them to be done. We just want people to do them who don't have this coercive power, who aren't trained to establish control at all costs, who aren't legally allowed to use violence against other people, who can't put somebody in a cage without unilateral discretion. Without cops in schools, we still have people in schools who are willing to risk their safety for the safety of others. Nobody should be put in that position who doesn't want to do that. Nobody should be asked to do that just because we're not having cops doing that. But there are people who are willing to create safe environments in schools and to break up fights, to have conversations with kids who maybe are acting in ways that put their peers at risk. And people who are willing to do that should be given the best training possible and all the support we have to give them. And the way that police are trained that's not the best training for that job. Police officers are not trained to specialize in de-escalating conflicts. They are not trained at all in nonviolent communication. They are not trained to work with kids, let alone kids who are neurodivergent, disabled, or dealing with trauma. Police are trained to establish control of a situation using whatever force is necessary. And they are trained to know that they are immunized from the consequences of harm that they might cause in that process. We have special legal privileges for cops that don't go away when a cop is working in a school. Things like qualified immunity and the reasonable officer standard give cops the authority and the discretion to use force when they want to and to initiate legal proceedings. Police presence in schools sets up a legitimate fear, as we've heard, especially for students of color and disabled students, that at any moment, honest mistakes or coming of age growing pains will be met with violence and humiliation. Regardless of how any individual officer might conduct themselves, our young people are aware of the facts and the systemic nature of police as a source of racism, misogyny, and sexual violence. Police are the 6th leading cause of death for young Black men. About 40% of police officers self-report as being domestic abusers. Of the reported cases of police committing sexual violence on duty, half of all of these victims are underage children. Even if a school has the nicest cop in the world posting up all day, it is a completely reasonable and rational response for kids to feel unsafe around them, given the pervasive nature of race and gender-based violence that is implicitly written into the training and culture of policing. I'm going to make this personal for a bit. We had an active shooter scare my freshman year at Hanover High School. Jodi Picoult's novel, 19 Minutes, which was allegedly based on Hanover High, was about this kid getting bullied and then coming back in and shooting up the school on March 6th. So the year after it came out, on March 6th, the administration was worried that some bullied kid at our school might follow this fictional example. So they called in the police and they had a bunch of cops stationed inside and around the building, but just for a day. And I remember feeling more afraid and not less because of their proximity. But above all else, I was angry. I was angry that the response to a school shooting was to address a hypothetical symptom of school violence and to do nothing to address the very real and ongoing harms that were already happening that made this hypothetical harm even a risk in the first place. Police address the symptom of the problem, and even towards that goal, as we've heard, show no statistically positive effect either in schools or in communities. Police have not been shown to reduce crime. We could meaningfully address these symptoms and their underlying problems if we reallocated resources to address the structural injustices that cause the problems that make us think we need police. So for schools, this structural setup means that kids take their problems at home out on each other in school. Kids come to school hungry. Parents and kids are not given enough support. Bullies follow the examples that society sets for them by treating humiliation and use of force as a legitimate way of controlling a situation. And that example is set for students by police. That is not the logic we want our children to be taught. Schools are a microcosm for society. And if as a society, we address the systemic causes of generational trauma, of mental health and addiction, of poverty, of racism, of sexism, of domestic abuse, of homophobia and transphobia with a fraction of the resources that we used to address the inevitable consequences of treating each other as disposable, we would not feel the need to legalize a sector of the population to wield the threat of lethal violence to make some of us feel safe at the expense of the actual safety of others. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kira. Incredibly powerful, but you already know that. I will remind folks once again to drop any questions you have for our panelists in the chat, and we'll get to them in a little bit. Asma, can you let our listeners know where we're at with the school removing SROs from Lebanon High School?
Yeah, thank you, Ed. Thank you for the panels. Were absolutely amazing, and I'm still like taking that all in. But yeah, unfortunately, the School Board of Lebanon has not taken a stand on this issue, which is a shame and further proves that police are incredibly powerful and no one wants to even question them, right? Or how it's okay to waste tax dollars on an officer versus using that money for counselors, for mental health professionals. And so since the school board has failed our students, in my opinion, by prioritizing cops over things that can truly benefit students, right? The things that they need. There was a warrant article that came out and it was signed by Lebanon voters and was submitted to the town so that we can take this to the town for a vote because they have yet to conjure up the bravery to just be there for our students and to ensure that they create a safe environment and put money where it should go. So yeah, we essentially want to reinvest or reallocate, Lebanon tax dollars, our tax dollars, right, and put that funding where it's desperately needed. Like teachers have said, there's not enough counselors in the school. There's not enough mental health professionals. So why is it that they're okay with having a police officer? And I know many people are saying, oh, but he's barely used. Well, you're wasting our money. Why is he even in there? Essentially, you're saying he's not used. Okay, great. If he's not used, why is he there? Because there is something that is needed for students, and why aren't we using that? So yeah, basically where we're at with that at the moment is it's going to be taken to the Lebanon voters so that they can remove the harm that the school board hasn't found in themselves to do themselves. And so that's where we're at.
Thank you so much, Asma. Okay, we're gonna pivot to some questions from the audience. If you have any questions, please drop it in the chat. While we wait for any questions to come in, do the panelists have any final thoughts to share with the folks with us? Okay, we have our first question, and this is for anyone. You can jump in. Has anyone here done any outreach to the individuals and families directly affected by this particular issue?
Yeah, thank you. And so, yes, students have spoken out. Unfortunately, because of the environment that we are currently living in, and I'm not just talking about in our town, I'm talking about nationally. When people come out, when people speak out, they are attacked. And so there are students who were supposed to speak and last minute decided not to, right? People are afraid to speak out, right? And I think it's important that when communities that are vulnerable are attacked, that we as a community, whether especially when we are of identities that are safer, like if you are white, right, to speak up and say this is not okay, right, and we're going to ensure that there is an environment that is safe for you. And also just to know, I've talked to students who've said, look, like, our officer has done nothing wrong to me. He's been kind to me. I've had students say that as well. And then they've also said, but why is he here? Why is he in my school? So it's just, the question is, why are we investing in something that is not beneficial to our students? Why are we relying on a system of punitive measures versus a system that's going to take us to a place where we're going to heal, where we can get to, where creating environments for students so that they can actually learn, right? Just thinking about the fact that, as some of our panelists have stated, the mere fact that they think there's an officer in the school does something to them. Our professionals, therapists has said that here today, right? The mere fact that they know that doing something wrong can actually get them in trouble with the legal system. It's not a mistake like when we made a mistake when we were growing up. We were allowed to make mistakes. Well, now there's an officer in your school, right? So, yeah.
Thank you for that, Asma. Any more questions? If any, just drop them in the chat. While we wait, again, our panelists, any final thoughts from y'all? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much to all of our guests and to all of you joining us for this episode of The Traverse. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this show and any ideas you have for future shows. You can find Rights in Democracy at rights-democracy.org and Rights in Democracy Institute on Facebook. And you can find the ACLU of New Hampshire at aclu-nh.org and ACLU of New Hampshire on Facebook. Remember that the police do not mean safety for all people. So let's keep that in mind, and may we get to a world where we all want to live in. Thank you all for your time and energy. We truly do appreciate it. Bye for now.